Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Penn Vicarage on this lovely sunny at the moment. Anyway, Thursday morning. Great to see you. I hope you're well and cheerful. And thank you, as always, for joining us for our Bible reflection for this morning. And today's chapter is a very, very special one. It's Isaiah and chapter 53, all about the suffering servant, God's servant, and what he went through and so on. And when I'll read this to you now, and when I read it, think Jesus, and you'll see what I mean. Isaiah 53. Who has believed what we have heard? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. And as one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our iniquities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted. He did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that's led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? He was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked, and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong. Because he poured out himself to death, and was numbered with the transgressions, yet he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for transgressors. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, this passage is often used at kind of Easter times and so on. Well-known passage, and obviously it's all about the servant of God, but clearly it's quite manifest this is all about Jesus. So taking it a verse at a time, firstly it starts off by saying, who has believed what we have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? In other words, the arm of the Lord, that's God's power and God's plan, if you like. And it's been revealed to those who believe. In other words, believing and trusting is what we have to do. Salvation for us is by faith. We don't win for ourselves, but we trust and we believe what God has done for us. So who has believed what we have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? In other words, believing is and those who believed at the time and those who believe now are those who experience the power of God in their lives. Then in verse 2, he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. But it's interesting here it comes out of dry ground. Now, dry ground, things don't grow out of it. And what he's saying, I think what he's saying here is that this isn't just come from ground as normal. This is an act of God. The ground was dry. There was nothing going, if you like. But the birth of Jesus was an act of God. The Messiah, the servant of God, was an act of God. I think that's important to say that. And he goes on in verse 2 then to say, he had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. In other words, Jesus' attraction, you might say, was not in his physical beauty. He wasn't a looker, you might say. He wasn't a particularly attractive person. He didn't dazzle people by his good looks and his blue eyes or whatever it may be, I don't know. He wasn't like that. He grew up as an ordinary person. I mean, people weren't drawn to him by his physical beauty. And he goes on to say in verse 3 that he was not only that, but he was also a man of suffering. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with misery. As from one for whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we hold him of no account. And you can kind of see that quite clearly in the time just before Jesus died, that he was mocked, he was teased, he was betrayed, he was crucified, and everything else. And people looked down on him, and people felt, some people anyway felt sorry for him. So we've got so far that to experience God's power, we need to believe in it. that Jesus was an act of God. He came from God. He won people by his integrity and his greatness, not by his good looks, if you like. In fact, he was a man of suffering, and somebody from whom people hide their faces, and so on. So that's that. And then he goes on in verse 4 to say that through what he has done, he has borne our punishment. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. So in a sense, the punishment that he experienced on our behalf. The fancy word for it is vicarious. He took our infirmities, he took our sins and so on himself. So he was a man of suffering, acquainted with grief, but in doing so, he carried the infirmities and the guilt and so on that should have been on us. And in verse 5 and 6, he goes on to say, he was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. In other words, it was our sin that put him on the cross. There's an interesting story by a guy about Mel Gibson, who starred in that famous film, The Passion of the Christ, which is a really gory film about the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. And what you don't know necessarily is that Mel Gibson's in the film, but all you see of him is his hands, because he wanted to be the person who pinned Jesus to the cross, because he believed very strongly that he's a strong Roman Catholic, and he believes that his sin are what took Jesus to the cross. Because it says here, Jesus was wounded for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. So quite clearly, the sin that was coming for us has been laid onto him. And in verse 6 it puts it there, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, but the Lord's laid on him the iniquity of us all. So we've all, as St. Paul would say, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But here, quite clearly, the sin, if you like, the punishment that we deserve has been laid on him. And in verse 7 to 9, you can definitely see things about the passion of Jesus. So you get that he was silent as a lamb. Notice Jesus was silent in the face of his oppressors. When you read in later chapters of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John about the passion of Christ, they actually accused him, but he was silent. That he was put to death by a perversion of justice. When the chief priests and so on tried to put the evidence together, it just didn't stack up. It was a version of justice. That he was put to grave with sinners. He was given the way he was put to death was the death of a sinner. It says in the Bible, "Cursed is the one who hangs on a tree." He was put to death with a robber on one side and a robber on the other, and yet he was given a tomb with the rich, because Joseph of Arimathea gave his tomb and allowed Jesus to be buried in that. Then in verse 10 it says, interesting here, it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. Because this was God's will. I mean, the night before Jesus died, Jesus says to God, is there any other way? And yet it's quite clear God's will was that for the salvation of the world, so that you and I can have our sins forgiven. Jesus did this because it was the Lord's will that it should happen. Jesus came on a mission. Jesus came, he lived to die, so that he could carry upon him the sins of us all. So it was good for us. He suffered, but he did it for us. It was God's will that it happened. Of course, this must be unbelievably painful for God to watch it happen, but nonetheless, it had to happen so that we could be saved, because it was the will of the Lord that this should happen. And it's as well. But at the end, he goes on to say that out of his anguish, he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. And in the end, of course, Jesus was resurrected. He was proven right. He ascended into heaven, and he, therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. In other words, because he did that, God glorified him. God raised him from the dead. He's ascended into God's right hand on high, and that's where he reigns to this day. He did this, my friends, for you and for I. He gave his life so that we can live. So, working way through it, who can believe? Verse 1 tells us that if you want to buy into this, it's those who believe are those who see the arm of God at work. Then you've got to see that Jesus came out of dry ground. It was God's will that it happened. It was an act of God that Jesus was born. That he had no no beauty, if you like. So he wasn't. People weren't drawn to him by his beauty, but actually something much greater than that. But in fact, he was a man of suffering and acquainted with grief. He goes on to say then in verses 4 and 5 that the punishment he took when he died on the cross was for you and for me, catered our punishment. And we have all, like sheep, drifted away, but the Lord has laid on him the punishment for us all. Then in verses 7 to 9, you hear a description that he was silent as a lamb, as Jesus was, that he was put to death by a perversion of justice, that he was crucified with sinners, and yet he was buried with rich people like Joseph of Arimathea. It was God's will that it happened. It was God's will that it had to happen so that God's will could be done, so that the rest of us, that on him, so that we can enjoy salvation, we can enjoy peace, and God's will can be done. And actually in the end, and that many will be made righteous through him. But in the end, he was proven right, and God raised him from the dead, ascended him to heaven, where he reigns to this day and always will. Alleluia. Christ is risen. He's risen indeed. Alleluia. Friends, I hope you found that helpful. More tomorrow. Have a lovely Thursday. Enjoy it. Thank you for watching. Do share this message with your friends and enjoy the rest of your day.